Good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The Trump Effect, What Businesses Need to Know About Sanctions in 2025. We are thrilled to have you with us as we explore the potential impacts of evolving U.S. sanctions policies and their implications for businesses globally. I am Safak, and I will be guiding today's discussion as your moderator. We are honored to have a distinguished expert with us, Bradley Henry, the partner and the vice chair at 𝗕𝗂𝘀𝗺𝗃, specializing in economic sanctions, white-collar defense, and regulatory compliance. Together, we will provide critical insights into how businesses should prepare for and navigate potential change in the U.S. sanctions under the evolving political landscape. Before we begin, a quick note that we encourage you to submit your questions in the Q&A section, and we will address as many as possible toward the end of the session. And let's get started. Brad, to initiate the discussion, can you briefly summarize the current state of U.S. sanctions policies and how they evolved over the past few years?
Sure, yeah. So sanctions have been pretty dynamic. As everyone on this call probably is aware, sanctions evolve sometimes hourly, especially now in the current administration and given the geopolitical stance in the world. So sanctions have been around for a long time. There are varying levels of sanctions and a number of programs that the U.S. government runs. The UK, the EU, the UN also run sanctions programs, though we're going to focus today on U.S. economic sanctions as it relates to the new administration and what we can expect or what we think we can expect from them. I think today, most, or at least for the last 4 years, I think what most people have been primarily focused on are Russian sanctions, which are evolving, and we'll talk a little bit about what we expect to see there. But the other thing that you could expect to see in this current administration is an increase or an uptick in Iran sanctions. There has been a lot of chatter about Iran sanctions and a focus on that. Even before Donald Trump came into the office, there were a number of actions taken by the Biden administration as they were winding down their term to increase Iran sanctions, especially as it relates to oil and gas. And we're going to talk about the ways that they did some of that, which makes it difficult to walk those back. But needless to say, it's been very clear from this administration that Iran sanctions are going to be sort of front and center. Interestingly, we're in a world now where the U.S. government has contemplated and said that they are going to designate cartels, particularly in Latin America, as foreign terrorist organizations, which then also, of course, results in potential sanctions issues there, not only for companies, Latin American companies, but foreign companies doing business in Latin America. And so that's something to keep an eye out on as well. And let me just say, I forgot to say, Safak, thanks for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Brad. So with the return of Donald Trump to the White House, what key shifts in the sanctions policies should businesses anticipate? And are there specific sectors or the regions that could be, you mentioned Iran, that could face heightened scrutiny?
Yeah, so I'm going to go through a number of things here that I think it's important to talk about, and I'm going to address a number of sanctions regimes. There are many, but I'll talk about the most important ones. I guess I'll start by saying that obviously President Trump likes sanctions. I think the administration likes the use of sanctions. Sanctions were created in at least sanctions as we know them today as sort of a national security tool, were created during a Republican administration during the Bush years, George W. Bush, and sort of the evolution of sanctions as we know them today started then. They're easy to implement without much effort. They're cheap. You can impose them without congressional action, which this administration, of course, with their executive orders, has been very keen on doing. And you don't really have to have any buy-in at all from opposing political parties. And so you get to bypass some of the hurdles that you would otherwise typically encounter with other types of economic tools. The Trump administration will continue to build on the Biden administration's existing framework, which was, of course, built on top of the Trump 1 administration's framework. And so I think we'll just continue to see an evolution of that. There's not going to be a lot of walking back, which we'll talk about in a minute. Of course, keep in mind that economic sanctions, pure economic sanctions, are just one tool in the U.S. government's foreign policy toolkit. And you've seen some of the other things that the government is using: tariffs, for example, export controls. There's going to be a lot of focus, I think, in the U.S. on CFIUS review for inbound investments, the same for outbound investments from the U.S. So we're going to see a lot of action there, I think, over the next few years. The key focus for, I think, primarily with the Turkish audience, a key focus is the secondary sanctions risk, our number one concern. We've seen a number of designations across Turkey, the Balkans, and the surrounding area as recently as it relates to the Russia sanctions. But keep in mind that there's also the risk of U.S. nexus primary sanctions because of U.S. dollar use, U.S. person involvement. And I think we're in this place where we're sort of on the very front edge of an enforcement landscape where, compliance challenges are going to rear their ugly head. The Biden administration was not really quite as strong in the enforcement space in sanctions, but I don't think that's an indication that there is not going to be enforcement. I think the Trump administration will be focused on enforcing. Keep in mind, over the last several months, the U.S. government extended the statute of limitations for sanctions violations from 5 years to 10 years. They did that very purposefully because sanctions investigations are very difficult to do. There is a lot of transaction look-backs. There are a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of obfuscation in some instances. And so it just takes a lot of time for them to put together these types of enforcement actions. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that as they begin to get those ready to roll out. In terms of enforcement and traditional OFAC action, there's not a lot of shift in the role of the enforcement division of OFAC, meaning that even though there's been administration change, the people at OFAC more or less remain the same. In cases that are on the books tend to continue even if a program is terminated. So take, for example, Russia sanctions. If ultimately there is an end to the Ukraine war and Russian sanctions start to be rolled back, you can still see trailing enforcement actions occur from that. And so that's something to be on the lookout for. Now, as it relates to specific country programs, we'll start with Russia because that's the one at the front of everyone's mind. Any shift in sanction policy, I think, will depend on reaching at least the first stages of an agreement to end the Ukraine war, including potentially a ceasefire. And before that, though, I think it's very likely that we will see more sanctions as it relates to that. I think we've seen some statements in that regard, and they're, again, an easy tool for President Trump to use as leverage in negotiations. And of course, we all understand that negotiations are all about leverage. And even against the backdrop of like the peace talks that are happening now, Trump and his team have made clear that they want to increase enforcement and add new Russia sanctions to put maximum pressure on and to use all available leverage against Putin. And just a couple of examples of things that have been said recently. Trump's special envoy to the Ukraine-Russia conflict, Mr. Kellogg, recently said in an interview that the U.S. Will increase sanctions on Russia to ramp up enforcement. Sanctions enforcement on Russia are only about a 3 on a scale of 1 to 10 on how painful they could be. And he also said that the sanctions themselves, such as those targeting Russia's energy sector, that there is still room to ratchet them up. We've seen that. There was an increase. There was some increased pressure as Biden was leaving his tenure in the Russian energy sector, sectoral sanctions related to a number of Russian sectors, including the energy sector, which has caused a lot of confusion and turmoil. So those are going to be important areas to watch. He also said you could really increase the sanctions, especially the latest sanctions targeting oil production and exports. It's open an aperture way high to do something. And if there's anybody who understands leverage, it's President Donald J. Trump. And you can see that with what he's done recently in the foreign problem solving. And so, the Russian envoy is the special envoy to the Ukraine-Russian conflict has made very clear that Russian sanctions are going to increase and they could get much more serious. So that's something to keep an eye out on. Treasury Secretary Bessent has also made similar public comments saying that he didn't think the current sanctions on Russia were strong enough. So I think sanctions are not going to go away overnight, especially as they relate to Russia. Even if President Trump wanted to unilaterally lift sanctions, President Biden double designated hundreds of entities under an executive order that's tied to 𝗬𝗂𝗧. And everyone here remembers 𝗬𝗬𝗧. And it gets a little technical, but the bottom line is for those entities who are double designated, you cannot lift those designations by executive action alone. It will require congressional approval. And so a lot of the most recent designations are going to be with us until Congress takes action. I think another thing to look out for in the Russian sanction space is a misalignment of EU, UK, and US sanctions. I go back and forth on this a little bit. Since 2022, US sanctions imposed on Russia have involved close collaboration with the EU and UK. But Europe and the UK have come a long way in their own right. The UK now has the 𝗕𝗂𝘂𝗺𝘂, which is a dedicated office related to economic sanctions and enforcement. But of course, there are, as everyone has read in the news, tensions between the US and the EU as it relates to the Ukraine conflict. And there's been, although there's been that history of collaboration, it may get a little trickier down the road. And so if you start to see a divergence between what the US is doing and what the EU or UK are doing, that's just, more that we're going to have to pay attention to and more that we're going to have to take into account in trying to avoid compliance failures. On the flip side of that, however, is and not that long ago, OFAC and 𝗕𝗂𝘂𝘂𝗀 issued a joint statement or a joint letter saying that they had taken steps to formalize a collaboration between the two, and that they would continue to work closely together in bringing enforcement action. So that's something to keep in mind. We'll see, if we get joint enforcement actions in the near future, while new designations or sanctions begin to diverge from each other a little bit based on whatever country their policy goals. So anyway, to wrap up Russia, enforcement's not going anywhere. Sanctions are not going anywhere. There's going to be a lot of action in Russia sanctions, particularly now. It may get a little hairy as we enter into this negotiation phase, as governments seek to end the war in Ukraine. Iran, I mentioned Iran earlier. Trump has already indicated in his first few weeks in office that he wants a return to maximum pressure which was the policy that he used in his first administration against Iran, which is basically to ramp up the sanctions on Iran to the highest level possible. President Trump talks about a deal with Iran, but given the U.S.'s close ties with countries seriously adverse to Iran, it's unlikely that that's going to happen, especially in the near term. We are much more likely to see tighter financial measures against Iran. Some of those are going to impact, of course, Turkish entities. They're also likely going to impact a lot of Chinese entities. And then other countries who may be affected by those controls are going to be the UAE, India, Malaysia, and other countries that do business with Iran on a regular basis. As it relates to Turkish business, I would want to be watching that very carefully. It's as we get into a phase where they start to focus more on Iran and doing that, you're going to want to focus on proactively mitigating those risks. Again, it's maximum pressure. So even if there is no U.S. nexus, the policy in the first administration and this administration will be, even if you're a purely foreign entity and not using U.S. dollars and have no real other U.S. nexus, you're going to see an aggressive use of secondary sanctions with the intended goal of completely cutting off Iran. Importantly, the U.S. is also now putting pressure on the EU and the UK to invoke full snapback sanctions, meaning that the sanctions would go back to the way they were in the first administration. And it's likely, even though we might see some differences in the Russia sanctions moving forward between those countries, it is very likely that we'll see unity and harmony between the coordination related to snapback sanctions. And so that's something to look at as well. Two other countries I want to touch on briefly are China and Syria. China, one obvious point for the near future is the focus on the China-Iran illicit activity involving Iranian oil. Those are easy options for Trump to include on sanctions, and things that he may be focused on are ports, banks, and infrastructure. And it could be something that they do, but the question is how does that fit within the goals of China policy more broadly? Of course, the U.S. Is very focused on China, and I think vice versa. So it's likely that we'll see quite a lot of talk related to China. We could also see an increased focus on sanctions against China, but I think in the first instance, there's going to be the tariff discussion, which we've already seen. And any sort of sanctions action against China will be focused primarily on the Iran connection, at least initially. And then finally, Syria. Of course, there are a lot of regional players, including Turkey, who are asking the Trump administration to move on the sanctions or lift sanctions here. It's my view that it's unlikely that that's going to happen. Unless there are some large changes that are made in the country, that could happen. But I think in the near term, we're not likely to see a lot of activity there. We did see in January, the U.S. authorized some limited transactions related to Syria. But again, that was a small change and doesn't seem to be a priority for the U.S. government currently. The U.S. is not going to rush it. So I think it is wise for companies to continue down the path that they've been on and be vigilant about Syria transactions. Some of the things that Syria, I think, probably is going to have to do, and Republican and Democratic lines are united on this here in the U.S., but the elimination of Assad regime chemical weapons, concrete action to take or to quash ISIS or Daesh activity within Syria. They're going to want to see them sever ties with Russia. They're going to want to see a crackdown on the illegal drug trade. They're going to want to see government concessions. So there's a lot of things that need to be done before I think we see significant movement with Syria sanctions. So the bottom line is the U.S. needs to see more from Syria to begin any serious lifting of sanctions there. And that was a long answer to the question, Safak. I'm sorry, but there's a lot to cover.
Thank you. And Brad, the sanctions compliance is especially critical for the sectors like defense, finance, and technology. How should companies in these industries proactively adapt their risk management strategies?
Yeah, compliance is an evolving thing, right? It's a dynamic and is always changing. I think the things that companies that I work with, right, we were and have been primarily focused on Russia sanctions. And Russia sanctions are difficult. I think most people would say Russia sanctions are much more difficult than Iran sanctions because it's not an embargo, meaning that there are things that are permitted as it relates to business with Russia, and you just have to be careful in considering the type of things that you are doing and with which parties you are doing them with. Whereas Iran is a little more cut and dry in terms of it's almost virtually impossible to do business with Iran. And I think that will remain true, but there is going to be much more focus on the enforcement aspects, I think, in this administration, which I talked about earlier. And so as it relates to the compliance function, I think it's a combination of doing what you've already been doing, which is screening for sanctions, doing the training, making sure your employees and the executives are all aligned as it relates to your policies and procedures involving sanctions globally. But I think there's probably going to be a need to increase the focus, not just on the compliance function, but what happens after an issue has been identified. There is going to be a lot more discussion around investigations. There's going to be a lot more discussion around what to do with the information once you receive it. Do you self-disclose? Who do you self-disclose to? And what what are the risks and benefits of doing that? It's too late if you are designated or receive notice that you are under investigation by the U.S. government. You want to have your sanctions policies in place and follow them. You want to train your employees. You want to seek licenses or guidance from OFAC when necessary to minimize your risk of business interruption. And importantly, your general counsel should be involved. Outside counsel should be at the ready in case there is an issue that comes up that is significant enough for you to seek outside guidance. Secondary sanctions, again, are going to be much more prevalent now than they were in the Biden administration. I think we can take the Trump 1 administration as a yardstick to what we can expect here. So pay attention to those broader sectoral sanctions and countrywide embargoes. Make sure you're considering your business in the context of that, and then really focus on your investigative protocol and what you do once you've identified potential issues and how to approach those. I think those are the things that are going to shift a little bit from what you would have typically been doing in your compliance program under the Biden administration.
Mm-hmm. And if Trump's administration takes a more aggressive stance on the sanctions, what legal challenges or the countermeasures could business explore to protect their interests?
Yeah. Well, I think I just mentioned one of them. One of the things that you could potentially proactively do is to seek licenses and/or guidance from OFAC. We as a firm, and I in my practice have been asked much more frequently now than almost throughout the Biden administration to seek additional guidance from OFAC, and in some instances, the State Department, who is working, of course, closely with OFAC and is now started making its own designations OFAC carries the designation out, but the State Department recommends it to OFAC. And so there's sort of a dual agency approach to the way sanctions are being implemented. So the legal challenges you're going to face are, of course, there's going to be, you may receive document requests or subpoenas. We've seen an uptick in that over the last several months, at least. We've dealt with some embassy to embassy communications, and so you will potentially see, the U.S. government reaching out to the local embassy to have a discussion about concerns that they have related to transactions that they've identified, which may be violative of sanctions, and they were going to want to engage in a discussion about that. We've seen more of that and have been engaged in a number of those discussions recently. I think there's a lot more sort of embassy to embassy or government to government discussion about these things, but as it relates to private business, right? And so, the government may get a reach out again about a private company, and then, that the Turkish embassy, for example, would reach out to the private company, and that's how they may understand that the U.S. government has some concern with a transaction that is occurring or a business that they are conducting that they view as at least problematic at that point in time. The most important part to be proactive is to just get ahead of these things. You can't, especially now with this administration, hope for the best and just don't take really any action. It is critically important to make sure that when you identify issues that you follow up with them, that you remediate and figure out what a solution to that potential problem is, and in the right circumstances to self-report that conduct and/or seek permission from OFAC and/or the State Department to continue on in that conduct. I think the Trump administration, the first time around and this time around, was actually fairly good about giving guidance and licensing certain activity. Back then, if you'll recall, there was a lot of activity related to the Venezuela oil sanctions. We were able to engage with OFAC on a series of Venezuelan oil issues and were granted licenses in many instances to continue to conduct what otherwise might have been sanctionable activity. And I think we'll continue to see that in this administration, a focus on using these as tools to change behavior in foreign places, but also an understanding that in the right circumstances, and if it follows along with the policy objectives and national security objectives, that there are certain activities that even if they were sanctionable, may be allowed to carry out with certain caveats or requirements. And so we should be looking at that as well.
Yeah, looking ahead, do you foresee increased coordination between the U.S. and the allies on the sanctions enforcement, or is there a risk of divergence in policy approach?
Yeah, I hit on this a little bit earlier, but I think it's both. I think we're going to see close coordination in some instances and a separation in others. It's sort of to be determined, but I think, again, as it relates to Iran sanctions, I think there's going to be a lot of coordination and everyone's going to be essentially on the same page. I think, globally, at least, the U.S. and her allies view Iran very much the same way, and the sanctions against Iran as giving or requiring the same sort of treatment. And so I think we'll see a lot of the same as it relates to Iran. As it relates to Russia, again, I don't know that there's going to be a ton of divergence. But there may be, it could be that the UK and EU, as negotiations begin related to trying to end the war in Ukraine, may find it in their best interest to take a different route with Russian sanctions as opposed to what the US may do. Of course, that could be completely the opposite too. They may say totally aligned and continue to do that. I think the U.S. and UK particularly will stay more closely aligned. I think 𝗬𝗂𝘂𝗺𝗃 in OFAC in their letter have said that they are going to be in close coordination. It may be actually the EU that we see take a little bit of a different tact, but it's to be determined, right? I guess what we've seen as it relates to this administration is it changes every day. There is a lot going on. There is a lot to follow, and so we'll see. We'll see what happens.
Yeah. Now let's turn to some questions from our audience. We will try to get through as many as we can in the time we have left. And the first question is, with Rubio being a Secretary of State, do you see maximum pressure on Venezuela?
Yeah, I don't. I think we can expect to see some movement in the sanctions as it relates to Venezuela. I think Rubio's sort of made his position clear, and so there may be an increase in that. I certainly don't think there's going to be any positive movement as it relates to Venezuela in terms of their sanctions designations. I don't know. I guess to me, it also depends on your definition of maximum pressure. Are we going to see an embargo against Venezuela like we see against Iran or North Korea? Probably not. Will we see an increase in sanctions against them? Yes, probably, for all kinds of purposes, not the least of which is to try to get them to do what the U.S. would prefer for them to do. So I think there will be an increase in sanctions there and probably of enforcement again, but maximum pressure in terms of getting to embargo status, I don't see that happening in the near term.
Mm-hmm. Second question is about the tariffs. Could you give information about steel and aluminum tariffs? Are there any changes specifically for Turkey, and how can we follow it?
Yeah, sure. So tariffs are interesting, and I will readily admit that tariffs are not my expertise. We have a team of people here that focus almost primarily or exclusively on tariffs and pure trade and custom issues. It will affect Turkey. I mean, of course, Turkey has steel exports. We saw, I think, in the first Trump administration that affected some Turkish companies as well as, of course, companies all over the world. I think Trump is more focused now on tariffs than he ever has been. We see that there's been a flurry of activity there, announcing tariffs against Mexico and Canada and then pulling them back, announcing tariffs against China. He's ordered the government now to look at reciprocal tariffs, which basically is if a country charges the U.S. tariffs on our exports to them, then we should then impose a tariff on their exports to us. So I think there's going to be a lot to follow as it relates to tariffs. My partners, Anthony Rappa and Joanne Ozendarp, are at the very front edge of the tariff issue. We also, in case you're interested, release what's called the Blank Rome International Trade Report on a monthly basis. It has information related to the tariffs that you can follow, and I know Safak on his website and his announcements follows those closely as well. So there's a lot of information to be had, and happy to discuss offline if there are particular questions.
Mm-hmm. They ask you to write the website. Could you write the website?
Yes.
The next question is, I was thinking about the new sanctions package from US that you have mentioned earlier after the Mar-a-Lago conference held yesterday. I was thinking about the opposite, so a mitigation of them to give to the Russia a signal. Can you please talk about it again?
Yeah. So I assume that question as it relates to the statements that were made after the delegations from the U.S. And Russia met, and what some perceive to be concessions to Russia, and the discussions surrounding that. I think the conversation in Saudi Arabia, right, where they created the 4-point framework to reach a resolution was, exactly what they said it was, right? It was the beginning of a discussion. I think both the U.S. Group and the Russian group saw it as a positive discussion, and that their sides were heard. But again, as we've seen with all things in the Trump administration, it changes day to day, hour to hour sometimes, and it is not unlikely that the negotiations are going to take several twists and turns, and that the things that are said now may hold or not, depending on what it is the people want to achieve who are in those discussions. We haven't entered into an actual negotiation yet. Of course, Ukraine was not involved in those discussions. The EU was not involved in those discussions. There's a lot of talk about what that all means. So I think as it relates to giving Russia a signal about the seriousness of the discussions, in my view, it will be quite the opposite. There will not be a lifting of or removal of sanctions. It will be an increase in sanctions to show strength, and to signal that we want to negotiate, but we are going to do so on our terms. So it's hard to read politicians. I don't know exactly what it means, but my view is, and my understanding from discussions with people in DC, people in the administration, internally with my group who have lots of connections, in the government, particularly to OFAC, that we're going to see an increase, despite what is said in the public.
The other question, Brad, is you talk about Russia sanctions being linked to a congressional law. What % required Congress to remove versus executive orders?
I don't know if I could put a percentage on it. Let me say this is, there are thousands of designations under Russia's sanctions, SDN or other lists of prohibited persons. The list that came out that was what I call the double designation, where the 𝗬𝗂𝗧 framework was used and would require congressional action, is a few hundred of those people. So in terms of a percentage, it's probably a smaller percentage of the overall, but those designations were of important companies. They were consequential in terms of the effect that they would have. And Congress, as you have seen, has been, even as it relates to the 𝗬𝗬𝗀 and the Turkish government, that they've been pretty hawkish, and very reluctant to overturn that or to use 𝗬𝗬𝗀 when they feel it's appropriate. And so I don't expect Congress to be doing anything with those designations anytime soon. And I think Biden did that very purposefully, so that if there is a point in time where President Trump decides that it is appropriate to start removing Russian sanctions, he's going to have an extra layer that he's going to have to go through to delist some of the more consequential designations under Russian sanctions.
I want to ask about the energy industry and the possible the further sanctions. What impact could the further sanctions on Iran have on Turkey's energy sector and trade routes?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the sanctions against Iran have been very harsh for quite a long time. I recognize, I think like most, that there is trade between Iran and Turkey. You can't share a 700-mile border with a country and there not be some trade. I think it is less about the designation or the imposition of sanctions at this point, and is much more about the enforcement of those sanctions, meaning that there are, if there is trade going on between Turkish entities and Iran in the energy sector, there are already the tools in place to do something about that. There's just been very little activity on that front, especially in the last 4 years. But I think we will see increased, activity there as we ramp up maximum pressure. When, maximum pressure is, while there are some financial controls that could be still put into place, and, there are a few gaps, generally speaking, the sanctions are in place. And if the government, chose to then go after, companies or individuals who are engaged in that trade, they could do so. I think that's the biggest risk factor currently is just the government taking action on those sanctions as opposed to imposing new sanctions that are going to have a huge effect.
Yeah. Thanks. No further questions? Okay, then. Thank you, Brett, for sharing your invaluable insights. This has been a highly informative session on the evolving sanctions landscape and its implications for businesses worldwide. And a special thanks to our audience for joining us today. If you have further questions, please feel free to reach out to us, and the panelists will be responding to you. There is a question, can you share the link? Yes, we will be sharing the link in coming days. And we hope to see you at the future discussions on international trade and regulatory compliance, and have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Safak. Thanks, everyone.